you go.
All right, good afternoon, everybody. I'm really glad to be here today. I feel like my presentation is a little bit unlike the other. So, we're going to transition a little bit to thinking about rural development broadly. So, most of my work is thinking about the non farm rural economy. And as I have gotten going and thought more deeply about this work, I want to expand the body of literature that focuses on the linkages between the non-farm rural economy and our farm and agricultural based segment of the economy as well. So I think that there is an opportunity to kind of link these two communities together and think about their success as being co-determined. So this is partly born out of maybe my own observation that I think in some circles, rural and agriculture are used interchangeably, and I would argue that they're distinct but linked. And then in other circles where we see the topic of agriculture, farming, or even dairy side by side with rural, but still kind of siloed, that they're not often thought about as, again, being sort of linked together. So most of this presentation is about rural livability. So this is my on-ramp into asking about this question. And then at the end, I'm going to try to link it up more closely with agriculture and dairy specifically. So I lead the Rural Livability Project on campus. This is funded by the Rural Partnership Institute in the College of Agriculture and Life Sciences. And this project is motivated to learn about highly livable places. What makes places livable? What makes people want to stay? What makes people want to come there in the first place? What makes people want to buy a home, raise a family, and start their businesses in these places? And we want to learn about these places so that we can translate it to places that are facing challenges. The reason we embarked on this project is because we used to think that people follow jobs. The literature, the research largely pointed to that. So if we can attract the jobs to our rural community, then the people will come. So that led to a focus on attraction and retention. So let's bring a business from somewhere else here to our rural community, the jobs will come, and then the people will come, and that will sustain and grow our community. Now, what we see is a pattern of jobs following people. So if we can attract people to our community, if we can attract families to our community, they'll want to be here, they'll start their businesses here, and that can be the thing that sustains and contributes to our community in the long run. So this idea that jobs follow people shifts the focus, right? It's slightly away from attraction or retention and more towards quality of life, or what we call livability. And so our focus here is, again, how do we sustain and support rural thriving in a way that emphasizes quality of life? So our first step on this project was to assess prosperity in the United States and in Wisconsin. And we wanted to take a step away from the emphasis on economic growth. Again, this is partly born out of wanting to reprioritize quality of life and put a people-first approach on community economic development. But I think this is also important for understanding a narrative of rural decline. So most of the systems that define rural and urban classifications are based on size and therefore linked to the idea of growth. So how big you are and how close you are to metro areas typically defines rural. So rural places that grow well enough, long enough, and get big enough are going to be reclassified as urban, and they're going to be in the sort of successful growing category. Rural places that don't grow as fast or don't grow at all are going to be smaller and considered less successful. But that's not really the case. Those of us that live in rural communities or have lived in rural communities know that there's a lot more to rural places than just growth, adding jobs, adding people, adding homes, adding businesses. There's lots of ways to think about the success of a rural community. And so you'll notice that none of these metrics are really about growth. They're still economic factors, but not necessarily focusing explicitly on growth. So we're going to look at low unemployment, low poverty, a low high school dropout rate, and low housing stress. And we're going to benchmark how every county in the United States is doing on these metrics, relative to the national average. If you're doing better than the national average on these 4 categories, you score a 4. If you're doing worse than the national average on all 4 of these categories, you're going to score a 0. Housing, in particular, is one category where we actually combine metrics about quality and affordability. Part of the value added, I think, of our approach is that we're going to look at this over time. So we're looking at this at 1990, 2000, 2010, and 2020. And I think thinking about prosperity as a process is really powerful because we're not just interested in a snapshot in time. We're thinking about, well, how does this change? And when you're thinking about how prosperity changes, that opens the door to think about, well, how do we maintain prosperity? Or if a place is struggling, how do we change the trajectory of prosperity to improve over time? So we started with sequence analysis. This is a technique we borrowed from the natural sciences, originally used for DNA sequencing. And we're applying it to prosperity, which is going to vary geographically and temporally. And what you're seeing here is just a random sample that sort of visually articulates changes in prosperity of 15 counties in the United States. So this row 6 represents a county. This county scored 4 for all 4 periods that we looked at, and it is going to be in our extremely prosperous category. County 8 scored below the national average on all 3 categories for our first 3 periods and then improved slightly in the last, so just to give you a sense. We combine this with cluster analysis, and we rely on algorithms to group these counties for us. We want to know how places that are lacking measurable prosperity are different from places that are extremely prosperous. A couple of things I think are interesting about this. One, we end up with different sizes of categories, right? So if we were to just use our own quantiles, or if we were to maybe group these ourselves, we might try to have evenly sized categories. And letting a cluster analysis give us the result shows us that the places that are lacking measurable prosperity are actually far fewer than the places that are extremely prosperous. So I think that that's a powerful story to understand. But once we have this in hand, then we can start to think about, well, what characterizes prosperity and how is it different maybe from less prosperous places? Here is a summary version of our prosperity analysis. So rather than looking again just at one point in time, this is a summation or a way to think about prosperity over that entire time period. And what you see is that Wisconsin is in the heart of a prosperous region. So the upper Midwest generally does well in terms of prosperity. Many counties in Wisconsin scoring in this extremely prosperous category. We can break it down though and get some more valuable insights. So if we take each year that we consider 90, 2000, 2010, and 2020, we see that 2000 was our most prosperous year when we had 48 counties out of 72 in this extremely prosperous category. If we want to understand what's driving the change, we can think about education and housing. So education is a space where we've lost traction over time. So we go from 93% of counties scoring better than the national average down to 49% in 2020. I want to be clear about what's happening here. When we see this decline in terms of the number of counties outperforming, this isn't because those counties were doing worse on education. It's because they were doing worse relative to the national average. These counties were actually improving, but so was the rest of the United States, and so that gap got bigger over time. So this is an opportunity to think about how do we look at other places to see what they're doing to maybe improve just as much. Housing, and I know that every community that I go into is dealing with housing challenges, but I find it in some spaces useful to reframe it as a Wisconsin-based asset because we're actually doing really well relative to the rest of the country on housing. And so we could think about this as an asset. Yes, it needs investment, or yes, it needs work. Yes, we need to think about strategies, but how do we preserve this particular dimension of our communities as an asset going forward? And I think that's important because it's going to link to the labor challenges that a lot of rural areas are facing. Another way to think about prosperity is how it changes across the urban-rural continuum. So what I'm showing you here is the average prosperity score by urban influence code for the whole country, with the most urban being a 1 and the most rural being a 12. And you see this U-shaped pattern. And I think this is also useful, again, for reframing a narrative of rural decline. What we find is actually something quite different, right? Where, yes, urban places are often quite prosperous, but so are the most rural places. And Wisconsin, as a relatively rural state, can think of rurality as an asset. So how do these ideas of prosperity link up with why we're here today, with agriculture, with farming, with dairy? And I think that this graphic is an on-ramp to thinking about that. So what I'm showing you here is the share of farm operator household income from off-farm sources by farm size. And if we think of, let's say, small farms as those earning 500,000 or less, Then this right-hand side of the graph shows us that small farms are getting at least 40% of their income from off-farm sources. So that tells me that the non-farm rural economy is pretty important for most farms. A lot of them might be working on town. Anecdotally, they're doing real estate, they're working at the school, they have other gigs that are complementing their farming sources of income. But I think it's bigger than that. I think, of course, our agricultural or farm-based or dairy households are also constituents on broader rural development issues, whether that's broadband, childcare, housing, or K-12 education. And so when we think about rural development, we can think of this as a really big umbrella that links up with the welfare of farm households as well. The point, I just want to connect to the plenary session this morning, and Mike brought up the way that healthcare was related across these different sectors of the economy. And I think there are lots of ways to start thinking about and understanding the linkages between our farm households and our non-farm rural households as well. So on that note, we started to think about, okay, well, what is the agricultural, the food, the dairy supply chain? What are ways in which aspects of these economic actors are going to show up in prosperity? And so we looked at the number, we started with the number of grocery stores, but we're going to march through several of these. The number of grocery stores per 1,000. And we asked ourselves, are the counties that are lacking measurable prosperity, for example, statistically different when it comes to grocery stores from extremely prosperous counties and so on? And we find that these are statistical, they might look small, but they are statistically meaningful differences. So it's just an on-ramp for thinking about these relationships. So we do see that our most prosperous places are different from those that are lacking measurable prosperity in a way that I think you would expect, right? Access to food, access to grocery stores being part of livable rural places. Number of specialty food stores, we see that same positive relationship where prosperity is linked to the number of specialty food stores per 1,000 population. Number of farmers markets, so getting into thinking about local foods. We also see a strong positive relationship. Number of farms with direct sales per 1,000 population, so another way to think about local foods. And again, we see this positive association between prosperity and what's happening in our food system. Orchard production is going to be the one graphic I show you that works in the opposite direction. And I think that this speaks to the importance of moving beyond exploratory analysis to think about what's driving these relationships. But we have orchards here working in the opposite direction. And that might be partly geographically driven if it's the case that orchards are concentrated in parts of the country that struggle with prosperity as we've measured it. Here we have the number of dairy farms per 1,000. And I think, if I remember right, this was the strongest positive relationship that we looked at in terms of this exploratory analysis. Again, this is preliminary. We're trying to think about the ways in which these are linked. I think there are lots of mechanisms we can potentially consider for what drives the relationship between our rural non-farm segments of the economy with our farm-based agricultural or even dairy-based components of the economy. But I think there's space here, or this kind of signals to me this is worth looking at, this is worth thinking about. There's an opportunity here. And I think what is most important for expanding the policy levers that we think about when we're talking about supporting farms or supporting rural communities. If these are linked in the ways that we find that are powerful, then we can support rural by supporting farming, we can support farms by supporting rural, and I think that that could be an important and powerful policy and strategy conversation. Number of cheese plants. Also, we see this kind of slight positive relationship here.
Are these national or state?
These are state, yeah. So the prosperity metrics that I showed you were, again, that kind of summary metric in terms of looking at all four cross sections that we considered over that 30-year time period. But what I'm more interested in actually is understanding the evolution of these two communities sort of side by side. So here we have a map that is the evolution of prosperity. And what we've done is shown you places where prosperity was consistently increasing over our study period, decreasing, fluctuated, so there might be some sort of shock, a community drops and then recovers, stable, and then we have a few places that we're missing. And so is it can we ask questions about, well, what happened to agriculture at a moment of increasing or decreasing prosperity? And is there something to say here about the relationship between? So one thing that our group is talking about is considering the power of consolidation. What are we seeing change in agriculture in terms of consolidation, and how do those effects transmit into rural communities? And is that something that we can better understand and better quantify? We're also interested in always prosperous places. So we have a handful of places that are prosperous from 1990 clear to 2020, and they're really unique and they're relatively rare. So we would like to understand what is unique about these places, and there are lots of dimensions over which we want to consider that. And I would argue that the sort of agricultural base is part of that discussion. Some closing comments here in terms of rural prosperity. What I'm showing you here is a relatively simplistic way to access this idea of prosperity. We only use 4 measures. This project has moved a year past that measure, and we're now incorporating ideas about health and environment and natural resources. We want to really embrace a multidimensional, multifaceted approach to rural prosperity that, yes, growth is important, but there are all of these other ways that rural communities are valued by the people that live in them, and we want to address that. And I think that we can do a better job of that by more explicitly and more thoughtfully incorporating agriculture. So with that, I will leave it, and thank you for your time. And I think, do we have time for questions? Did I talk too long? Okay.
Yeah, first of all, for the 15 sample counties that you discussed, is their identity withheld for a particular reason? And then going on to specifically Wisconsin, I was surprised that some of the counties, such as in the southwest part of the state and also Florence County, were shown as relatively successful economically. I'd always been given to think of those as somewhat chronically problematic areas economically within the state. And then that brings me up to another point you showed about orchards, where number of orchards was not necessarily an indication of prosperity. And I'm wondering if that's due to the chronic, I guess, relative level of less economic success in the southwest part of the state, where there are, in fact, many fruit orchards. Mm-hmm. Thanks.
Yeah. I think I heard 3 questions. I'm going to try to get them all. So this idea of was identity suppressed for any particular reason? No, and I think that we could look at just Wisconsin counties or just a region. So there are different ways we could redo that. That would be more informative. This was just to more demonstrate how the method can work and what it looks like. In terms of this sort of tension, and we have run into this in many conversations, right? Of like, well, this place doesn't look like I thought it was going to look in terms of our prosperity analysis. And I think that there are a couple things going on here. I think that step away from growth is really powerful in some spaces, right? That once we start departing from growth as the only way to define success or prosperity, then we do start to tell a different story, and that can be incompatible with some people's perceptions. But I think we also have here too maybe a limitation of our work at this point, right? Where we're not really fully incorporating what it means to be successful. There are many dimensions. And like I said, economic growth is important. So I think with our team, we're still figuring out, well, what is the balance between growth and all of the other stuff that is also important? And I think as we fill that out, I'm hopeful that it will line up more closely with people's lived experience of their rural communities. I will highlight, my husband is from Monroe, Wisconsin, Greene County. Monroe has been at about 10,000 people going back, I think, the full length of this study. It just really hasn't changed a lot. And that's an example to me of like, we have a really nice community, but it's not growing. So if we only focus on growth, it's not going to show up as a nice place. But I think the lived experience of people there is largely positive. And so I'm trying to, again, navigate this space. And as an economist who mostly focuses on growth, I'm leaning on my sociology colleagues, among others. Yes, we have an interdisciplinary team to help us navigate that space.
maybe time for one more question if anyone has it.
Super interesting stuff. And maybe this is a thing you can do in the future, but have you thought a bit about the sort of farm size and I was about to say growth, but whatever, prosperity or livability, and how those two are related?
We have. I mean, within our team, and we're still exploring the way to move forward with this segment of the work, but that is at the top of mind in terms of has the shifting kind of industrial organization of farming, of maybe dairies in particular, how does that matter for rural places as we've seen farmers get bigger? Does that change the arrangement in such a way that is meaningful for the livability of rural communities? I think related to that is age of the operator. So as farmers get older, does that increase the probability for absentee landholders? And does that also reshape the character of rural communities in a way that's important?
Okay, I think with that, we'll wrap up. We just one more thank you.